Dear viewers and listeners of Khabarhub and Radio Candid, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to the very special interview with Ambassador Shivshankar Menon on India's foreign policy. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon was a distinguished fellow with Brookings India and is currently a distinguished fellow with the Center for Social and Economic Progress. He is chairman of the advisory board of the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. Ambassador Menon served as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India and as Foreign Secretary of India. As career diplomat, he has served as an ambassador or high commissioner of India to Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. He was a member of India's Atomic Energy Commission, and he also served in India's mission to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna and in the Department of Atomic Energy in Mumbai. Ambassador Menon has been a Richard Wellham Fellow at MIT and Fisher Family Fellow at Harvard University and a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group and a distinguished fellow of the Asia Society Policy Studies Institute in New York. In 2010, Ambassador Menon was chosen by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. He has authored Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy and India and Asian Geopolitics. Ambassador Menon, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let me first start talking about your recent book. Could you please share with us a little bit about your new book, India and the Asian Geopolitics, the Past, the Present? What are the major changes when we compare the past with the present?
I think the book is really about India and her relationship with the neighborhood, but not just the subcontinent or the Indian Ocean region, but Asia as a whole. Because I think that is really an under-examined aspect of Indian foreign and security policy. And so what I tried to do was to look at it from a geopolitical point of view, see whether a geopolitical lens actually makes sense. And then to try and project forward. The basic message of the book is that we are now actually in a very strange situation between orders, as it were, in Asia. We live in a globalized world, but politics has become very local. And because we are no longer either in a bipolar Cold War world or in a unipolar post-Cold War moment when the US was the only sole superpower, today the situation is much more confused. Because of that, actually, you can see that many of the disputes through Asia, flashpoints, hotspots, are all live again. And politics has become much more difficult. You've seen the rise of authoritarian leadership in several countries. Internal politics also has got complicated. So, and the result is that today, actually, we have transnational problems like climate change, cybersecurity, maritime security, etc. But we have much less ability as an international system to deal with it, because we now have leaders who base their legitimacy on nationalism, ultranationalism, and therefore find the sort of compromises, etc., that you need to make to find diplomatic solutions. They find that more difficult than their predecessors did. So we are in a difficult situation between orders, and the book, I think, says what should we do in this situation. Of course, it's a book written from an Indian point of view. And the two or three basic conclusions that I come to, which of course I'd be happy to discuss, I'm sure other people have other views. One is that India does best when she is most connected and engaged with the rest of the world, when she is outward looking. Partly it's her history, it's her geography, it's her location, it's also her resource endowment. India depends on the world for energy, for non-ferrous metals, etc. So it's a strong plea for engagement, actually, with the rest of the world. Secondly, that the neighborhood is critical, and that India's relations with the neighborhood, and so it actually says that we need to invest much more in what we're doing in the subcontinent, in the Indian Ocean region. And thirdly, I think it also makes the point that because we need to engage for our own interests, I mean, it's not out of some altruism or anything, because we need to work with our neighborhood, that we also probably need to relook at our economic and other policies. because we are in a new situation. And what it finally suggests for Asia is that instead of trying for some big architecture, either I don't think that the world is bipolar or multipolar or anything like that yet. It's still evolving between orders. So in that situation, the best thing to do is to build issue-based coalitions of the willing and able. Those who want to contribute to solving an issue and who can contribute should contribute. I mean, UN peacekeeping, for instance, Nepal has a role, But when it comes to maritime security in the Indian Ocean region, it would be unfair to ask Nepal to do something. But certainly for India, that's a very important issue. So we look for partners. So it'll be different sets of partners for different issues. And for some countries, some issues will be important. For others, some other issues. It'll be difficult. It'll take a lot of hard work. But for me, that's the way forward in today's confused situation. But that's the basic thesis of the book.
Ambassador Menon, how has the strategic importance of the South Asia region changed over years? How will the situation in Afghanistan affect the security landscape in South Asia?
Well, I think South Asia has become much more important. We were lucky in a sense during the Cold War, when the basic fault line between the Soviet Union and the US in the 50s, 60s, etc., was in Europe. Germany was partitioned, that was where they faced each other, and they fought their wars around us in Asia, throughout the Asian rimland, actually, whether it was Korea, whether it was Vietnam, in the Middle East, through proxies, but their struggle went on. And South Asia was a sideshow, frankly, during the Cold War, which was good for us because it left us time to deal with our own. We could all be non-aligned to one extent or another, with a few exceptions, and we could concentrate on building our own states, which were new states, many of them, and also concentrate on our own economies because we needed to improve the well-being of our own people. Useful, but today we're in a very different situation. Today, the center of gravity of world geopolitics and of the world economy is next to us. It's in Asia. It's in the Asia-Pacific. And whether we like it or not, most of the problems are in our neighborhood. So whether it is China-US rivalry, it plays out around us. And it actually comes to us and drags us in. As somebody used to say, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Whether it is, I think Nepal faces this, for instance. The US is interested in Nepal for its Indo-Pacific strategy. China is interested in Nepal for its BRI. These are all part of their bigger strategic moves, but everyone becomes important. Nepal has always been important to China because of Tibet. But these are additional factors which actually drag us into global geopolitics. Asian, certainly, but also global. So from an Indian point of view, for instance, our economic future is tied to the rest of the world. Almost half our GDP today is the external sector. Imports, exports, goods, services, remittances, etc. Capital transfers and flows. So if you add all that up, and you are also now located geographically where all the excitement is, as I said. Today, you can't afford to be a passive spectator. You can't opt out of what is happening in the world. So we need a much more agile diplomacy, politics, and ability to deal with the forces that are around us.
Ambassador Menon, should India recognize the Taliban government in Afghanistan?
That's a decision that, frankly, the government is best placed to make because we recognize states. The theory, at least, is that India recognizes states. Governments we deal with when they have effective control. Now, I think the Taliban government is taking its time settling down. The world hasn't yet recognized it. In fact, even the countries who were supposedly very close, some of which have actually helped the Taliban to come to power, even they haven't formally recognized the Taliban government. I think the question is maybe a little premature. Now, for me, more important is the actual outcomes on the ground that India works for. And there, I think India should be working to try and make the Afghan people's lives better. And I don't think this is a question of, do we recognize a government? Do we get into, I don't think this is a state-to-state game at all. In fact, the state of Afghanistan is obviously very precarious and fragile. And I think the situation in Afghanistan is still evolving. So I'm not sure that question is really ripe yet.
Ambassador Menon, how has India's strategic priorities evolved over years? What is India's current grand strategy?
Well, I think India's grand strategy and goal, basic national goal, has not changed since independence. It is to transform India into a modern, prosperous, secure country where every Indian, he or she, can achieve, has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. That's the national goal. And it is our goal, has been for the last 70 plus years since we became independent. And frankly, we still have a long way to go. We might have done well so far in terms of improving our condition. When you compare where we are today, at independence, we had life expectancy average around 26 years. We're now talking of, 70 plus in the next census, which is coming. We had literacy of about 17% or 14%, only 8% among women at independence. Today, we're talking about the high 70s and much higher in some parts of India. So there's been a huge shift and a huge change in our material condition. But we still have a long way to go. There's still hunger, there's still poverty. COVID has actually set us back by a couple of years. It will remain the goal, which means that India's foreign policy, India's security policy, has therefore two simple goals. One is, of course, to secure India. I mean, India's territorial integrity, its values, etc. But more than that, it's to create an enabling environment to the extent that we can for the transformation of India, which means working with other people, which means a peaceful environment, a peaceful neighborhood, a peaceful periphery, if you want to call it that. So for me, therefore, these are lasting. How you achieve it will depend on the situation you're in and the means that are available to you. Those means have actually grown considerably over time. Today, India has means which she never had at independence, or even 40 years ago, 30 years ago, as a result of the high growth years between sort of 2002 to 2012 especially. India has a certain weight, a certain influence, has certain capabilities, is a military power, has certain abilities today which she didn't have before. So we can try and help to create an environment which helps India's transformation. Trouble is the situation has got much worse. The world economy has slowed down. I mean, the Indian economy did well in the high globalization years, those decades, those 2.5, 3 decades. But the international situation, as I said, is much more fraught, whether it is geopolitical tension, whether it's a slowing global economy, and a certain degree of deglobalization, which is going on. And so today, actually, we're in a different situation with better means, and therefore need to adjust day-to-day tactical policies. But the goals will stay the same. The strategic goals, the grand strategy will stay the same. Question is, how do we achieve our goals in this situation? And that, I think, I try and lay down. I have a chapter on India's tasks in my book, in India and Asian Geopolitics, which actually tries and lays this down. And this is where the neighborhood becomes very important, both for security, because frankly, all our borders are porous and we all have transporter ethnicities. These are all new lines on maps, but this is not where communities, where life goes on, trade, travel, pilgrimage. The normal business of life actually doesn't recognize many of our so-called boundaries in South Asia. And I think it's important that we actually recognize that and make life easier for our own people by opening these. So my own approach to that problem is You can't change the boundaries because that affects people's sense of their nationhood and their identity and so on. Don't change them, but make them irrelevant to the daily business of life for your own people. And I think that will, so in that sense, integrate the subcontinent. But I think the subcontinent becomes much, much more important because our security is also interlinked. What happens in one of our countries affects the other. And there is no, we can say that there are hard boundaries, we build fences, but those don't make good neighbors or for security. So for me, it's very important what we do, we together in the subcontinent actually do going forward.
Ambassador Menon, let's move to China. China is a major strategic challenge for India. What is India's current China strategy, especially after the Galwan clash? Does India lack a viable strategy to compete and catch up with China?
Well, I'm not sure that we lack a strategy. We have a strategy, and it's a long-term strategy. And actually, if you look at the actual behavior of various governments of India, doesn't matter what political party is in charge. For several years, Indian strategy has been quite clear. It's been to maintain the status quo on the border as it is, using whatever means we can, creating an effective balance so that changing that status quo becomes difficult, and then keeping it peaceful while we go about the more important business of, as I said, transforming India, etc. We have other things which are more important things to do than getting into conflict with China. In 2020 spring, China tried to change the status quo, succeeded in part, but then had to withdraw. In fact, I would say that they didn't really achieve very much by all that we have achieved is today, or that China achieved by trying to change the status quo, is to provoke a big Indian reaction. We now have confrontation on the border, and the relations are basically in crisis, political, military relationship, and that has to be rebuilt. So there's talks between the militaries, there's talks between the experts of the foreign offices, the diplomats, and we have to see where that will go. It'll take time. These things, you know, we've gone through such phases in the past. It's never been an overnight solution or a quick solution to these things. But at the same time, we still have a working relationship with China. And both governments have been very careful in how they deal with it in public. You'll notice their public statements. They don't try and exaggerate the nature of this, the conflictual nature of this relationship and so on. And last year, China regained her position in 2020, same year as all this was happening on the border, regained her position as India's #1 trading partner. And the first 6 months of this year, India-China trade has set all kinds of records. So it's a complicated relationship. It has elements of competition. It has the world's biggest boundary dispute. It has, you name it, it has it in this relationship. These are two very large civilizational entities next to each other who've been dealing with each other in various ways. So there's more to this than just a pure state-to-state calculus that you might make for two countries which are on opposite sides of the globe. And that is why, for me at least, it's going to be a complex process of evolving this relationship. I think both governments are signaling they don't want to get into conflict or into trouble. Let's see where they take it. It's very hard in the middle of a crisis to predict where it's going and how it will be dealt with. But for me, the hopeful sign is that both governments are saying similar things, not identical, because they see different ways forward, but they do want to move forward and move out of the present crisis, which is a hopeful sign. And let's see how it goes. I think the core issue here is that we rub up against each other in the periphery that we share. Both countries today are much more involved with the rest of the world, and in some ways are more dependent on the rest of the world. Both China and India depend on the world for energy, for markets, for technology, for a whole host of things. And therefore, some elements of sort of competition, even conflict, are likely. But that doesn't mean there won't be cooperation, there won't be working together, and there won't be other understanding. I think COVID has complicated this for both because, everybody has limited bandwidth to deal with issues in the last 2 years. In 2020, 2021 are hardly normal years. So let's see if we are over the hump and past the extreme stages of the pandemic, if we're learning to live with COVID, as seems likely globally, then, I would expect that as we move forward, we will then start dealing again with things in a much more regular and systematic manner. Let's see.
Ambassador Menon, from 2000 to 2014, you served as Indian Ambassador to China, Foreign Secretary of India, and the National Security Advisor of India. You closely followed the second term of Jiang Zemin, 2 terms of Hu Jintao, and more than a year of Xi Jinping. How different is Xi Jinping? Is he really more powerful than the previous presidents of China?
It's an interesting question. I don't have the answer because I don't know the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party. But certainly from the outside, it certainly appears that he has centralized a lot more power, that he has also imposed his personal stamp on the party state to an extent that maybe nobody since Deng Xiaoping had done. Whether it matches Mao's, I'm not so sure. People keep saying new Mao Zedong, but I'm not so sure yet. I mean, don't forget that Mao Zedong was chairman of the party from Suni from 1934 until he died in 1976. That's a long time, and so yes, he's centralized power. Yes, he has put his own stamp. And it's very easy to ascribe everything to the leader's personality, especially in a Leninist state, where the tendency is for power to be personal and centralized. But how much of what he's doing is a reaction to what he sees as a much more adverse external situation? How much of this new assertive policy, for instance, how much of it is because of the conviction in the general Chinese leadership that relations with the US have become antagonistic, that the US is determined to prevent the attainment of the China dream or to prevent China's rise, that there is a strategy of maritime containment of China by the US and her friends, and this sense that therefore, although China has done wonderful things in the last 40 years through reform, open door, to pull herself up by the bootstraps, to become a middle-income country. But that the environment is much harder now, that there's how do you keep this going? How do you avoid the middle-income trap? How do you avoid actually being contained or strangulated by this US-led coalition, as it were? How do you deal with a much tougher external economic environment and with major internal issues as well, after all, including an environmental crisis brought on by very rapid growth and the nature of the growth, and a changing society? How do you keep the party's role and rule in a brand new society, actually, where things have changed and where it's aging rapidly, so that the advantages that you had before are not going to be there 10, 12 years from now. So how to ensure that China dream by 2049? That, I think, is, so it's one thing to say, oh, his personality and so on. And it's much easier to explain things like that on television, for instance. It makes for a simple story. But I'm not so sure how much is, it's not just him. Don't forget, everybody else is also working in China. There are other leaders. There are others who are going along with this. And of course, those who opposed him, Bo Xilai and the others, have fallen by the wayside and been dealt with very brutally. Unlike in the past, they were actually jailed and so on, which in between opponents were not. But that might be personal style. Let's see. So I think it's therefore difficult for an outsider like me to actually compare. But we'll have to see. The interesting thing, I think, is that he has said things which, in the recent past, especially when he talks of attacking inequality, of attacking monopoly, when he talks of China needing to create more trust abroad, a more lovable image, I think is the way Xinhua translates it. So these suggest that he's adjusting to what he sees as changes abroad. And so it's not just here's somebody with a strong personality who's determined to have his way and has set ideas and therefore is doing the same thing, but he's adjusting all the time. And that, to my mind, is a hopeful sign, because it's precisely that resilience, that ability to adjust, that has made the Communist Party of China one of the longest lasting authoritarian parties in power. I mean, the Soviet CPSU lasted 74 years. The only one that's longer is actually the North Korean party, I think, the Workers' Party of North Korea. Since 1946, they've been in power. So it's still an evolving situation, to my mind. It's still a process. And Chinese politics is always not opaque, at least to the outsiders. The one thing we can always say is that all the predictions that we make about Chinese politics normally end up wrong. That we are quite consistent about.
Ambassador Menon, at this particularly fraught moment in Sino-Indian relations, do you think India has abandoned a scholarship on Beijing's contemporary politics to grapple with continued challenges from China? I'm raising this question because in October 2014, you had mentioned at Brookings Institution that we probably understand China less today than we did before. Has the situation changed?
I think it's improved, actually, in the recent past, for 3 or 4 reasons. One is many more Indians are familiar with China. We run I'm chair of the Ashoka University Center for China Studies. And there's a China-India Visiting Scholarship, which we do, an annual thing for scholars who want to study China in their own disciplines, whether they're economists or management or engineers or whatever, doctors who want to study. And the response is really very strong. And the number of Indians who actually, in their own fields, know about China, I was very impressed by the numbers. That is a new development. And it's a result of the last 20 years of travel, trade, of people actually being much more, and of Indians being much more open to the world, and therefore finding out about China in their own fields. China studies itself still needs a lot of work. I mean, scholars specializing on, say, China's politics, China's economy, that needs more work. I mean, there are political science people who are interested in China, but it's a side, and I think that needs more investment, more work. But those are not things, area studies like that are not things that you build up overnight. It's not just a question of money and people. It's a question of time, of building up schools, traditions, habits of scholarship, and institutions of scholarship. And I think we have the beginnings of that. We had a meeting the other day of centers which teach China and and various aspects, whether it's history, whether it's politics, and so on. And I was impressed by the interest in the students for this. So there's demand and there is interest. And it's not as though, bad relations mean less interest in studying China. If anything, actually, much of the China studies, when I was comparing in 2014, I was comparing with the 60s and 70s when relations were much worse. And yet there was much more scholarship. So in some ways, actually, a difficult political relationship between the states actually encourages more scholarship sometimes. You see this in US scholarship on the Soviet Union, for instance, or now in US scholarship on China. As the relationship gets difficult, there's an incentive to actually study more.
And Mr. Menon, you just mentioned about Soviet. Why is Russia no longer a strategic ally for India in the new bipolar world led by the US and China?
Well, Russia is still a strategic partner. and is still very important to India. I mean, for the basics, I mean, you look at our major weapons platforms, Russian, apart from what we build ourselves, ships we now build ourselves. But so Russia is still a very important partner. And as I keep saying, she will remain important because India is both a continental and a maritime power. So for India to deal with the Eurasian continent, Russia, Iran, very important partners. These are countries that we will work with together. And every government of India, no matter what its ideological shape, has done so in the past, and I think will do so in the future as long as they bother about Indian interests.
How will the US defend India's position to secure a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, considering India's importance in the region and its strong relationship with India for the Indo-Pacific agenda?
Well, I don't know whether these two are linked. I think India and the US have a certain congruence on maritime security through the Indo-Pacific in keeping those sea lanes open, safe, free. But I don't think either side has linked that to whether India has a permanent seat in the UN Security Council or not. I don't think we should, frankly. I'm not sure that these two that it will make too much of a difference to how we cooperate, whether we have a seat or not. Whether we get a seat, permanent seat on the Security Council or not there's a simple mathematical formula. All 5 of the permanent members and 128 member states of the UN have to vote for it. I don't think there is any immediate danger of that happening right now. So I don't think that's linked to how India will deal with the rest of the world or with the issues or with the US or with any of the other countries.
Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pramod. Good of you to have me.